Stream your favorites and discover more with the Disney Bundle. Watch the new season of Loki on Disney+. On Hulu, fear creeps in with the boogeyman. And touchdown with college football on ESPN+. All of these and more streaming now. Get the Disney Bundle with plans starting at $9.99 a month. Plans with ESPN+ starting at $14.99 a month. Terms apply. See DisneyBundle.com for details.
I'm Todd Jones, recovering from 30 years as a sports writer. Thanks for joining me as I sit down with some of the best sports writers of our time, who knew the greatest athletes and coaches and experienced firsthand some of the biggest sports moments of the past half century. We'll share stories behind the stories, some we've only told each other. Pull up a seat on Press Box Access. There's an old file cabinet in the basement of my home. Inside that is a folder with the heading, Pierce. The folder contains articles written by Charles Pierce. Old pieces, hard copies, on paper, from trees. I haven't thrown out those articles because I occasionally go back and read some of them again when I'm trying to write and need inspiration. With that in mind, perhaps you'll understand my excitement about Charles Pierce being a guest on this episode of Press Box Access. Pierce has been a pillar in the Boston journalism scene since the 1970s, and his work has appeared in numerous national publications to widespread acclaim. Charles was kind enough to pause from his current job as lead political writer for Esquire magazine to join us and reflect on his experiences as a sports writer. Our conversation rolled so effortlessly that we went longer than usual, so we're going to make this a two-part episode. Enjoy this part one. Charlie, thanks for walking into this den of iniquity known as Press Box Access.
Well, I'm looking around at the iniquity, and it's all, obviously very high-tone, high-end iniquity, so I'm feeling very comfortable here.
Well, it's too bad we couldn't go to the Fours up in Boston. We could have had Johnny the bartender.
Well, you couldn't go to the Fours even if you were here. The Fours was a COVID casualty. We, almost every one of my favorite writers, post-game bistros is gone. The original Runyons in New York, the Lions had in New York. Obviously the Fours down the street, although I'm more of a Sullivan's Tap guy myself. They got the old line bar about a half a block towards the Garden from the Fours. And I remember the Bean Pot, the college hockey, the annual college hockey tournament with the 4 Boston schools, lost its liquor license because it had served an underage drinker. I don't know, I guess the year before, and it lost its liquor license for one night of the tournament. So I get off the subway and I'm walking into the Garden, and I look over and there's a line around the corner to get into Sullivan's. And so I go see what's up this. So I walk in there, I go into Sully's, and I asked the old bartender there when the last time they had a line to get into Sullivan's was, and he said VJ Day.
Well, it's funny that sports writers start off talking about bars. You'd get the schedule for whatever team you're covering, and you would look at the cities, and they're like, oh, Indianapolis, slippery new to win.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. One of the great impromptu moments at the Noodle. Whoever was playing there that night, somebody in the audience, some inebriate, was yelling for them to play Hendrix, play Hendrix, play Hendrix. So finally, the guitar player, and luckily I can do prop humor, he says, "Okay, fine, we're going to do the only Hendrix song we know, but we need your help." And I'm sitting there going, "What? Hendrix didn't do a sing along. What are we going to do? Sing along to Are You Experienced?"
Right.
And the guy says, "No, I want everyone to pick up their beer bottles." And so we all pick up our beer bottles. I don't have a beer bottle. I have a Gatorade bottle here. But he says, let's, this is what I want you to do. And so it was jammed. It was, I think, a Final Four, as I recall. It might have been one of the Olympic trials or something they had over there. Anyway, so he said, pick up your bottles and do this. And of course, everybody went on their beer bottles, and the guitar player went down, 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 down. Oh, we know. I'm sorry.
Well, I'm sure the Noodle and I appreciated it.
The Noodle and I are old friends.
Well, Charlie, I've been a student of your writing all these years, and I appreciate your time joining us. I know you're very busy on the front lines of our insane political world with your Esquire blog and your articles. But obviously, we're going to talk about your career in sports writing, because those who know you as a political writer, you've actually spent bulk of your career doing a lot of sports and in different magazines, and Boston Herald, Boston Globe, the old Boston Phoenix back there, the alternative paper back in the 70s. So I was just curious real quick, when you think about all these years in sports writing, how has that informed your work in the blood sport of politics?
Well, I mean, I think, if you do sports writing correctly, and certainly a lot of the people you've already had on this particular podcast have done it correctly, you really did get to cover almost everything that was important in society as a whole. You had to deal with race. You had to deal with the influence of mass media in its many forms, from the invasion of television into everything to the invasion of the internet into everything. You had to deal with poverty. You had to deal with the kind of descent from political activism into 80s and 90s, greed is good, and now back into activism again. So if you cover sports and you keep your eyes open and you pick the right stories, you're doing all of that anyway. You've got an invaluable window into everything else that's going on in society. And I can talk to a congressman from inner city in Cleveland, because I went to the Huff to cover basketball years ago.
Right.
Or I went to Bed-Stuy or Roxbury in Boston, to cover and to write about athletes. So I think, as I said, if you do it right, and I like to think I did, as I said, a lot of the people you've had on the show here have done, then you're essentially covering America, which is what political writing should all be about anyway.
Right. I always took the tack that I was a sports writer, but I'm really writing about people, and people as they try to exist in this contrived environment of sports and the changes the culture.
You're dealing with people who are living, quite unnatural lives, and they're doing it in the full view of the public. And I always say one of the reasons I enjoyed writing sports was to watch sports. You don't get to see, live demonstrations of human excellence in that many areas these days. And not only that, it's the only entertainment, genres of entertainment that we have that's a true mystery. I mean, there are thousands of productions of Hamlet all over the world. Every year. There's actually a number. Somebody counted once. I can't remember what it is. And it's Hamlet in modern dress, Hamlet in drag, Hamlet in traditional costumes. But the fact is, in all those performances of Hamlet always dies at the end.
Right.
Sports is entertainment where generally you don't know the outcome. And that's, to me, that's wonderfully entertaining. And,
how many times did you sit there and you go, oh my God, I can't believe that. And then you got to write it.
Well, that's just it.
All right. Well, let's talk about this night. About this night. It's 1986, Game 6. It's the Buckner game. Everybody knows the Buckner game. By the way, I think I have friends who tell me that Mookie beats out the hit, that he beats out the roller, even at Buckner Field.
Well, God knows I don't even want to know how many times I watched the replay in my life. But I don't think Stanley gets to first base. I think whoever told you that is probably right. The real problem in that game was that, they left, Calvin Schiraldi was out there in a state of catatonic shock, and they left him in there for about 3 batters too long. But throwing incredibly straight and incredibly slow fastballs.
Slow balls.
But yeah, I mean, it began as, it was a miserable night, first of all. It was, October, and it was raw. And
were you in the auxiliary press box, or were
I
you
was
inside?
In the aux box on on in what apparently was ordinarily a luxury box down the third baseline.
There wasn't
right
much luxury at Shea Stadium. I know that.
Well, Fenway, you're in right field, the right field bleachers. You're not even indoors.
I sat out there. I sat in Fenway out there for a World Series, and I had the fans around me chant, media sucks throughout the game as I was trying to write.
Yeah, the right field bleachers in Fenway were a lot nicer when it was just gambling.
All right, well, let's get back to Shea. The Red Sox are on the verge of ending this curse, and there's a slow roar to Bill Buckner. You already have things written.
It goes long before that. There's a prologue to the story.
All right.
In the American League Championship Series, in Game 5, the Red Sox are losing to the Angels, and a friend of mine he's leaving business after the series. He's leaving the business whenever the baseball season ends, and so the Red Sox are down, a couple of runs, and they're running out of chances, and the Angels are going to win the series. And my friend starts unloading his, overloaded briefcase that he probably hasn't cleaned out, since 1981. He's throwing away notebooks and media guides, and essentially he's throwing stuff up in the air. He's already written his lead about how the Red Sox lost the series to the Angels. And then Dave Henderson comes up. They get to one strike away, just as they eventually would in the series. And the Angels do. And then Dave Henderson hits the ball in the center field, and the Red Sox eventually lose the game. And my friend starts digging around in the trash can to get all his stuff back. All right. So I've already seen what can happen if you get too cocky with 2 outs and 1 strike away. So I'm up in the odds box, and I've written my at least the top of my Red Sox beat the curse sidebar, and the other sidebar.
This is for the Boston Herald, right? This is when
right. This is when I was at the Herald, exactly. And before I started writing columns there, and so I had done that, and I my other sidebar was going to be Dave Henderson, because if you recall, he hit a home run he hit a home run in extra innings that put the Red Sox ahead. And then Marty Barrett got an RBI, and they were up by 2 going into the fateful, Buckner inning. And so I was going to write about Dave Henderson in this I had a reasonably good relationship with him. And, he's had this incredible postseason where, they're going to be putting a statue to him, up in outside of Fenway, because he won the Angels series for him, and now he's won the World Series for them. So I got everything planned out. I've written a huge chunk of Dave Henderson bio. I've got my beat the curse lead, probably 5 paragraphs. It's all done, and then it all happens, and I wind up going down to the bowels of the stadium, as you do in big events like that. Just so you get in the locker room, you won't get tied up in the elevator for an hour and a half or whatever. And so I'm in the hallway outside the Mets or the Red Sox clubhouse, and stuff starts happening outside, and you start hearing cheering. And I can't remember who it was, had a transistor radio, and they had it onto the broadcast of the game.
Well, wait a minute. Transistor radio in 1986. Yeah. I love it.
Yeah. I don't know if he was expecting, we were all going to have, a power outage or something, and we were all going to need a crystal set or something, but he had it. I can't remember who it was. And we were listening to it. And then all of a sudden, this battalion of riot police comes tromping down at double quick down the passageway towards the field. And now we're figuring, hey, what the hell's going on out there? And that was the way I heard the Stanley Wild pitch and the Mookie grounder. And as I was listening to the radio, the people came in, some attendants came in and rolled the champagne out of the Red Sox locker room, and then collected all the World Championship T-shirts and put them in a bag and rolled them out of the Red Sox.
Wow. So you didn't actually see it, the ball go through Buckner's legs?
I didn't see. In fact, I didn't see the Stanley Wild pitch that set up the eventual disaster for a week after the World Series was over.
Wow.
Because the next day was supposed to be Game 7 and got rained out. So we had an entire day to do nothing but think about Game 6. So we all went to Runyon's to think about it. And
of course,
then just as a sidelight, my friend Mike Madden, the late Mike Madden, who used to write for the Boston Globe, and Madden was a real horse player. And so we were watching the races from, I think, Aqueduct at that point. And Randy Galloway, that scamp from Texas, decided we should all, start gambling on the races we were watching. And it took Madden and I like a half an hour to realize that they don't run on Sunday in New York, and that Galloway had been past posting us on Saturday's races and had taken us for, I don't even know how much money at that point.
Well, so take us back to Shea.
What? That livened up the rain, the rainout day.
Take us back to Shea. You're down there outside the clubhouse. The Red Sox blow this game in horrific fashion, and now you have to go into the Boston clubhouse. What was it like in there?
Oh, well, it was in shock. And like I said, Calvin Schiraldi was catatonic. I mean, I approached the guy, I sat there with about 5 other people, and then eventually about 40 other people, around him, and he was staring, at something, 25 or 30 feet away that only he could see. And then, I don't know who it was, went over and told Oil Can Boyd, whose turn it would be to pitch in the 7th game, that Bruce Hurst was going to pitch in the 7th game. And Oil Can went into hysterics. I mean, sobbing and screaming and crying. So it was extraordinarily strange. And eventually I wound up, leaving the locker room and going to the interview room.
Did Buckner talk at his locker?
Boy, eventually, yeah. I know they didn't bring him out, to the interview room. They brought the managers and I think Marty Barrett came out, because Marty Barrett or Bruce Hurst, probably Marty Barrett would have been the MVP of that series. He hit .414 in the World Series and would have, hit, one of the insurance runs in what would have been the deciding game. At this point, I was robotic. And the only thing I had in my mind was that I had to get upstairs and somehow make sense out of this in 15 minutes. And so I went up, once again, I went to the elevator, went upstairs, sat down, erased, all of my previous work, and just turned off, most of the circuitry in my brain and just wrote. And then, the lights went out in the stadium and I didn't even notice. The Red Sox traveling secretary, somebody had hung around in Shea after the game and thrown a bottle into the darkness and hit the Red Sox traveling secretary in the head.
Really?
I didn't even know that. I didn't know that for another week.
Damn it.
Because I was so focused on getting words into the little telegram and praying that the telegram would work. And then, I to this day, I don't remember what I wrote. I really don't. I mean, I assume it was coherent and people seemed to enjoy it, but it was, I've never been on complete automatic pilot like that before or since. I mean, it was appalling and wonderful and an experience I've dined out on, ever since then. But boy, at the moment, it was something I would never want to go through again. I mean, I didn't know if I was at this point, if I was writing in like Sanskrit. I had no idea. I was just putting words into the machine.
Well, if I was there, I just would have gone with it was a dark, stormy night and said, screw it. This is what you're getting.
I toyed with the idea of using using for my lead, and they were all hit by a train in the end.
Oh.
But I decided that my desk wouldn't understand it, which is one problem I had, with the desk at the Herald very often.
Well, those are the kind of crazy moments that, like you said, in sports, you just don't know what's going to happen. And you have had those moments all over the world. Sports and politics can be crazy. It can also take you to places that you never thought you would go to at some point. And in 1988, you were at the Summer Olympics in Seoul, Korea, and something else crazy happened there. First of all, I have heard, sources have told me that the writer across the hall from you in the media village was my longtime dear friend and mentor, Tom Archdeacon.
Tom was, he was across the hall, and he was, Arch is a force of nature, as you know. I mean, he's a large, hairy Sasquatch-looking beast, and a wonderful guy. And he and I and the late Shelby Struther, who is probably my best friend in the business, and God knows died a couple of decades.
1991, fabulous writer. Yes.
Yeah, a couple of decades too soon. Anyway, we were hanging together through most of the Olympics. Anyway, we lived in what was then the press village, which were these apartments that they'd thrown up, I think, in about 11 minutes. But they were planning on renting out as soon as the media was the Olympics were over. So one morning we had these wonderful Korean housemaids who would come up and do clean the rooms and stuff when we were out working. And so it was right towards the end of the games when you didn't have to get up real early anymore because there wasn't a lot going on except for track and field. And I was up and getting something for breakfast, and I heard this ungodly scream out in the hallway. And I went to I didn't know what it was. I went to the door and I opened the door. And what happened was that the little Korean housemaid had been confronted at the door by Tom Archdeacon wearing only his boxer shorts.
What?
And I don't think she'd ever quite seen anything like Tom having been rousted out of bed, wearing only his boxer shorts.
All right, I can't wait to talk to Tom.
He was incredibly terrified.
All right, well, let's get back to sports. At those games, the crazy thing that happened, obviously, is Ben Johnson. Ben Johnson defeats Carl Lewis in their showdown 100 meters. Ben, whose eyes looked 40 shades of yellow, sets the world record, is the big story. And you think you're done, right? You think you're finished.
Well, no, first of all, and you can ask anybody who was in the stadium. Tony Kornheiser and I have discussed this. Regardless of what happened subsequently, it was one of the greatest sporting moments I had covering sport. It was one of the greatest moments I had covering sports. Everything about it was perfect. I mean, the time of day, the importance of the event, the way the light was falling. I mean, everything was like if you were filming a sports movie, this is what you would have filmed. It was extraordinary. The stadium was just absolutely electric. And then they fire the gun and Ben Johnson comes out of it like this bull. I mean, the guy was, first of all, the guy looked like Emmitt Smith. Mm-hmm. And as you said, his eyes were an inhuman color. And he just, he blazes through, beats Carl Lewis, the world record falls. It was just a great thing. So we all go, we all go crazy about this wonderful thing we just saw. And then I went out with Arch and Shelby to Itaewon, which is the bistro and shopping center that sprung up in Seoul, mainly at the time when it opened to service the American military presence there, but is now kind of an an open air, bacchanal. So we stay out till I don't even know when. And, I get to bed. I set and just fall into bed, boom. And I get a phone call after I swear I got 20 minutes of sleep. And I wake up and, I've got, John Henry and his hammer working behind my eyes. And it's my boss from Boston. And he says, you got to get on and of course, deadlines, the international dateline being what it is, I was on deadline at 4:00 in the morning because it was, 11 o'clock at night back in Boston. So he calls me and says, you got to get down there. Something's going on with Ben Johnson. I said, so I get up somehow, throw on the clothes that I had taken off 20 minutes before, get on the media bus, which picks up, it takes me down to the big media center, and I'm feeling awful. And I feel awful until I walk in and I see a table full of the Canadian guys.
Yeah, because Ben Johnson's from Canada, right? Yeah.
Because, I instantly feel better because they obviously feel worse. Yeah. They have many of the same problems I have. Plus, they have to cover, their country's Black Sox scandal in the next 15 minutes. And, half of them are running out to the airport and buying tickets to Toronto in the hopes to be on the same airplane as Ben Johnson as he scoots out of town. And the Olympics people are trying to, make sense out of everything. And anyway, there's a press conference where nobody knows anything except that he flunked a drug test, and they're trying not to tell you what he took. And the representatives from the Caribbean nations, the Bahamas, Barbados, Jamaica, are all up there, trying desperately, to disprove the notion that, all of their countries are basically open air pharmacies for track and field athletes. And we all had about 15 minutes to put this whole thing together. And there were only 2 of us at the Olympics for the Herald. The Boston Globe had sent 7 people, which is what they did usually at the Olympics. And there were only 2 of us. So, one of my colleague, the great Frank DeLappa, he went out to the airport and I stayed, around Media Central. And then I wrote and I realized that given the time differential, I was done for that day and the sun wasn't even up in Korea yet.
Nice.
But to this day, I will forever treasure the 20 minutes to a half an hour before that race when everything was still this incredible atmosphere and, zeitgeist in the stadium. I mean, it was extraordinary.
Well, to go from one extreme to the other within not even 24 hours, and you throw in a trip to the bars with Shelby Strother and Tom Archdeacon, that's quite a day.
Well, that was a rich full day. Yes, that was an adult portion. That was definitely an adult dose. I wound up like buying a suit coat in Itaewon. I don't remember when, but I've only worn it like twice because it's incredibly garish. But the prospect of writing on these bizarre deadlines was just, it took some getting used to. You were on deadline, back in Boston from about 6 a.m, and then you couldn't file afternoon in Seoul, except for the next day.
I remember being at the Sydney Olympics, and I was there for the Columbus Dispatch, and you couldn't figure out what day it was. Like you said, you're writing a running, swimming story in the morning. It's like, what is going on here? Because I don't even know if it's Tuesday or Wednesday or what the date is, and this is really before the internet had taken over everything. So the challenge was just to figure out what the hell time is it, and what am I what angle am I trying to take here?
Yeah, and by the way, writing a running on a swimming race is not easy because there's nothing going on. And
I will tell you this.
Whatever else is going on underwater.
Hey, I once wrote a running hammer throw story at the U.S. Track and Field Championships in Sacramento. My local guy was throwing the hammer. Now, you write 3 versions of hammer throw on Deadline. Try that.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're, unless the guy loses control of the hammer and goes into the stands like a automobile tire or Indy and kills about 8 people, you're really out of luck, because basically it's a big guy grunting and then this thing flying through the air and taking, a world-sized divot out of the ground.
I think my second edition lead was Ibid.
So how did your local guy do? Did he win?
He did not, but he did fairly well. And I must say it was a life experience, right? I got the right running hammer throw. And that's what this is all about. I think back on all these years, 30 years of doing it. And, you started doing it in the 70s, and you add up this mosaic of experiences and places and people. And it is such a rich tapestry, not just for a writer, but for a person. And yours started back at Marquette University in the 1970s. And I think one of the things that I always tried to take this tact with writing was be curious. Nothing's new. I mean, it's happened before if you have a sense of history. And I think George Reedy at Marquette University drummed that into your head too. He was the dean of the School of Journalism there. Yeah,
he was the dean of the school. He's the reason I, did not become the one lawyer that broke the camel's back, because I was let us say an obstreperous student. I realized very early on that I walked into the J school writing better than most of my professors did. And I tumbled early on to the fact that was not going to make some of them happy. But Reedy was the one who insisted that because at that point, right now, the Diederich School of Journalism at Marquette is just a wonder. I'm constantly stunned by the improvement they've made. At the time, when I went to the J school, it had lost its accreditation the year before I got there.
Oh, welcome.
So, look, Reedy insisted that and as such, to get enough credits to graduate, I had to fill up my schedule with other courses. So Reedy was the one who insisted that I take a lot of history, and that I take a lot of I had to take 12 hours of theology, and I didn't want to sit there and listen to lectures about all these lugubrious Germans in theology. But I found a guy who taught scripture history. He taught like 4 courses in scripture history, which would fill my requirements, and I took all of them. He did a course on the Dead Sea Scrolls. He did a course on the Gnostics. And so, by the way, when Dan Brown and Da Vinci Code came along, I was prepared and ready, baby. I had studied all this stuff. I knew the gospel of Mary. I knew the gospel of Mary, baby. Anyway, and so I filled it out that way. And he's the one who impressed upon me that the main thing about making a career in this silly business is to stay curious, to maintain your curiosity. And that while very little of what you'll be covering is unique in history, most of it is new. And it's new to your readers. It's new to you. And that stayed with me my whole career. And thank God for George, because it was what sustained me through 4 years of J school. I would have transferred out of journalism, but there's absolutely no way I would ever have transferred out of Marquette. I was having too good a time.
Well, you were there at a great time to be a young sports writer. Obviously, the Marquette basketball team, the program was being run by the colorful Al McGuire, the Bumblebees uniforms, the characters.
My next door neighbor in the dormitory for 2 years was Maurice Lucas.
Is that right?
A great human being, a great guy, and taught me.
Went on to be a very good NBA player, obviously on championship teams, and
he taught me just about everything I know about modern jazz. he had this great record collection. And, he'd play, the Jazz Messengers or Weather Report or Jaco Pastorius. And I didn't know. I mean, I had grown up with my father on big band jazz and Dixieland jazz because that's what he listened to. And I rock and roll too when I, developed my own taste. But I had, the first guy who ever played Miles Davis's Bitches Brew for me was Maurice Luckett.
Nice. All right.
And he was
good for Mo.
He was he was gigantic. I mean, he was the biggest human I'd ever seen at that point. But he was a terrific guy. He was and a great neighbor. I mean, things were quiet. I suspect that, I think that the calming presence of certain Native American religious vegetable compounds were involved. But whatever, late at night he'd put on Coltrane or McCoy Tyner, and the walls were made out of paper mache at that point. And I'd have Coltrane coming through the walls, wouldn't be asleep at night.
All right.
So it was and as I said, I fell in love with the school. I fell in love with Milwaukee, and the industrial Great Lakes Midwest in general.
Because you had grown up in New England and you grew up a college basketball fan, and that's kind of how you ended up at Marquette, right? Well,
I to this day, and I embarrass Curry Kirkpatrick by saying this, his story that appeared in January of 1971, which was my senior year in high school, called Crazy Cat and the Curious Warriors, which was about the 1970-71 Marquette team, which was undefeated until they lost to Ohio State in the regionals. And in the game, Al McGuire said was the only time he'd ever been screwed without getting kissed. The only game Dean Nemringer ever fouled out of. Anyway, Curry wrote the story about, basically it was about the undefeated team, but it was about the whole, wacky culture of Marquette basketball. And it's what flipped my decision to go to school there.
Wow.
Because I wanted to be part of it. I wanted to go to J school, and they had a J school. So that was cool. And it was Catholic university. So my parents couldn't complain that much. My Jesuit uncle was, knew people there, and because they'd gone to school together. And, I had this wonderful college basketball experience ahead of me. So that convinced me. The last deciding factor in my choice of college was Curry Kirkpatrick's story in Sports Illustrated.
That's great. That's really great. The impact of sports writing, right? Think about it. The impact of a sports story.
The impact of Andre Laguerre's Sports Illustrated.
Right.
And with its incredible, bench strength of talent with, Dan Jenkins and Frank DeFord and Curry and Tex Mawley and I'm going to miss somebody, Mark Cram.
Right.
There are so many sports writers of my generation who went into the field because they wanted a piece of what Sports Illustrated was selling.
Right.
And I think that era's Sports Illustrated changed the whole game. It proved you could write humorous and literate sports writing and make it sell. And I know at least 10 people whom most of the people who watch this podcast will recognize, who said that they got started, waiting for that Sports Illustrated to come in through the mail slot on Thursdays.
Yeah, I was one of them.
I always tell people that there was a time in my life where I couldn't think of anything better than being in Norman, Oklahoma with Dan Jenkins on a football afternoon. And then once I grew up, I wound up in Norman, Oklahoma on a football afternoon, and I realized that the thing that made being in Norman on a football afternoon great was being there with Dan, because he took you there, from your suburban home in Massachusetts to this, all these people he met. But otherwise, Norman is just kind of a, college cow town.
Right. Well, that was the key, taking you there as the writer. College basketball is kind of a through line for you when you think about your career. I know you entered the U.S. Basketball Writers Association, inducted you into the Hall of Fame in 2018, and you started with Al McGuire as a college student, and covered so many Final Fours and characters. What was it about college basketball that kept you intrigued as a subject to be written about?
Well, I really started, my father and I went to every home Holy Cross football and basketball game from the time I was about 8 until I went away to college. So that's where the love really came in. At that time, Holy Cross was playing like what passed for a national schedule in both sports. I mean, I saw Larry Zonka and Floyd Little play for Syracuse. Wow. I saw Dave Robinson play for Penn State.
Sure.
They came to Worcester to play Holy Cross. I saw, Jimmy Walker play for Providence because they came up to play Holy Cross in basketball.
So you grew up with the sport. Yeah, I
did. And, I liked the atmosphere of it. It was, I just liked basketball. I always did. It was something that appealed to to both my athletic sensibility and, I think of the best line I think ever written about basketball was written by Jim Carroll, the poet and rock star, and in his time, one of the best basketball players in New York as a high school student. He said, in basketball, you can correct your mistakes immediately and beautifully and in midair. And I think that's basically what has kept me going back to it.
Yeah, as someone like myself who grew up in Kentucky, went to the University of Kentucky, I can relate in that I grew up with it. And in the early part of my career, I was fortunate to be a beat writer for college basketball in the city of Cincinnati. So I know, looking back at my own career, one of the special things was always the Final Four. I was fortunate to cover maybe a dozen of them. But that Saturday doubleheader, the atmosphere and the feeling, I don't know if that rang true for you too, but if so, what was it about college basketball and especially the Final Four?
That's a great, that 25 minutes is and of course, now given, the demands of television, that's a terrible deadline too for anybody who's there covering it, because you almost never get to watch the second game, or at least a big portion of it. But yeah, that anticipatory hour, before, I always try to get to the Saturday doubleheader as early as I can, because I just want to sit there and soak it in. And this is even when I'm not covering it per se. But the other thing that really energized my love for college basketball was that I was working at the Boston Herald and taking it on as a beat at the time the Big East was really exploding. And I had just wonderful coaches and games and athletes to hang with.
Give us an anecdote from those days as a writer who was watching this Big East explode into what it became. What comes to mind when you think about it from your perspective as a journalist? Well,
what was interesting was that it exploded virtually from nothing. And it exploded full blown from the mind of Dave Gavitt, who saw everything that was going to happen in college basketball about a decade before everyone else did, and 2 decades before it actually happened. And the great thing about the Big East was if you called, at least prior to its becoming a giant sports enterprise that eventually imploded on itself and reconstituted itself right as it is right now, was that you could call any of the coaches and they'd call you right back. You call Dave, he'd call you back in 5 minutes. And so you got to, there was a fellow feeling, and we weren't homers, but there was a fellow feeling among the people who covered the league that we were all somehow being hauled along on this enterprise. And, as I said, it was just, dealing with, John Thompson and Louis Carnesecca and Rolly Massimino and Jim Boeheim. The four coaches in college basketball that I dealt with in Boston when I started at the Boston Herald were Gary Williams at BC, Jim Calhoun at Northeastern, Rick Pitino, and then Mike Jarvis at Boston University, and poor Frank McLaughlin over at Harvard, who just, and I would call, we're talking about incredibly ambitious guys, everybody but Frank. And, I would call each one of the other coaches and they would explain how crazy the other two coaches were. And then I'd call Frank and he explained to me how crazy everybody was. So it was a terrific time. And, Gary was just burning to get up, eventually did to Maryland, and Calhoun was burning to get into the Big East because, he had pushed Northeastern about as far as it could go. And, eventually did the Connecticut, and, you talk about a career explosion. And, Jarvis and obviously Pitino, I don't have to tell you about him. And, and Mike Jarvis was pretty much the same way. So it was incredibly fertile, time to cover college basketball. And it was, the games were just, some of them were just epic. I think of, watching Pearl Washington at Syracuse. I was there the day he hit the midcourt shot to beat Boston College, that famous, video that ESPN has of the late Tom Mees throwing the elbow to keep the people off him. I was under the table after the ball went through because people came over the table to rush the court. Every Georgetown Syracuse game was a German opera. I mean, it was two, you talk about two teams that really don't like each other. That's a cliche. Those were two teams that really didn't like each other. And that really energized it. And, it's never let go.
Well, let's stay with basketball, but let's go into the pro ranks. You're a Boston guy, Boston Herald, Boston Globe, grew up in New England. When you think of Boston and basketball, the first name that comes to mind is Bill Russell, obviously. But in your era as a writer, it's Larry Bird. And you wrote one of the great pieces that I remember as a young writer reading. That's the 92 Esquire piece, The Brother from Another Planet. It really was looking at Bird through the prism of race a little differently than everybody else was looking at the thing between Bird and Magic. Tell us about your experiences with Larry Bird and what went into that.
Larry Bird is one of the most fascinating human beings I've ever met in either of my particular journalistic enthusiasms. He's just an interesting human being. First of all, and I said this in a lot of different forums, he grew up in southern Indiana, poor and white. In southern Indiana, which was the birthplace, number one, of the modern Ku Klux Klan. And second of all, was a place so marked by white supremacist violence that civil rights pioneer Jim Farmer wrote in his book that it was worse than Mississippi, that he found it more dangerous than Mississippi. And Larry grew up, by all indications, completely unmarked by that particular odious current of American culture. He doesn't see race. He never did. And he never saw it, as near as I can tell, he never saw it as a teenager. He certainly never saw it as an adult. You talk to Jalen Rose or Reggie Miller about having been coached by him. Jalen Rose says he saved his career. But Larry he didn't see it. He wasn't marked. It didn't bother him. He hated the whole white alt thing because it was so different. It seemed so far out of his ken. It was a dynamic he didn't understand.
I think that's why your 1992 Esquire piece, The Brother from Another Planet, left a mark on me because it made me see Bird in a different way. It was using the prism of race, but in a way that shone a light on that topic and Bird much differently than everybody else was kind of cookie cutting it.
Yeah, I mean, he understood the dynamic of people using him for their own, nefarious psychological purposes. He understood that. He hated it, but he understood it. He had clearly studied it, and thought about it. He thought about it deeply enough to reject it from the bottom of his soul, but he wasn't going to let it touch him. and it never did. The great thing about the interesting thing about Larry was that there were always myths about him. And that outside of what we just talked about, the two presiding myths about Larry Bird were, one, that he's not athletic. And that was based solely on running and jumping, which even track and field doesn't see as the summation of athleticism. And I've said to this day that anybody who thinks Larry Bird wasn't athletic never shook hands with him. Because from the elbow to his fingertips, he was one of the greatest athletes I ever saw. The combination of hand-eye coordination, and his hands were battered. I mean, he kept breaking his fingers playing softball and stuff. But from the elbow to the fingertips, he was stronger than anybody I ever saw. You can count on the fingers of one hand the number of times people got a rebound away from him once he latched onto it. And the other thing is, the easiest way to end up with an empty wallet at the end of a long evening is to think Larry Bird is dumb. Larry Bird is a very, very smart man. I tell people all the time, syntax is not intelligence. Unlettered does not mean unread. This guy is an extraordinarily intelligent person. Somebody who's taken the lessons he's learned through his own life very much to heart and has evolved as a human being as much as anybody I've ever seen. I am a complete admirer of the person that is Larry Bird. I mean, I think he has built the life he wanted to build in his own way, and he's done it in a way that wasn't destructive to very many people. That wasn't destructive to many people. There was the whole thing about his daughter that he had when he was young that he had not brought into his life, and that's a real brown spot on the apple. But by and large, this is a very highly evolved and very intelligent human being. To say nothing of another worldly, basketball talent. That's beyond a pro. One of the great things I used to love was getting to Celtics games early and sitting down, and Larry would come out and shoot with Frank Attato, one of the assistant trainers, would fetch the ball. And he would come out. First of all, he'd go up to the third level of the old Boston Garden and run laps around the balcony. And then he'd come down and he'd just shoot. And it was like watching a sound check from a great band. They tell the story about the Watkins Glen Festival where the Grateful Dead came out and did a sound check that went on for like an hour and a half. And then the Allman Brothers insisted on doing a sound check that went an hour and a half. And then the band came out and did a sound check that lasted an hour and a half. And a day before the show, people had already seen a great concert. That was like watching Larry. I mean, Larry would come out and just, he was very, very regimented, very, he had a very clear program of his pregame shooting. But it was like watching a master at work. I mean, it was like watching a great musician or a great artist. And that was one of the things that, because I was in the profession, I was blessed enough to be able to see, because the Garden wasn't open when he did it. I mean, nobody else was there except us.
So who's in the building? How many people?
The Celtics staff is in the building, and eventually at some point the other team shows up, so their staff comes in the building. But there's nobody in the stands really. And then he ducks into the locker room and goes through whatever he has to go through, and then he comes out and the building's full and he starts the game. But it's those quiet little moments before the game that I really felt privileged to be around.
Speaking of privilege, it's been all mine to have Charles Pierce on this podcast, and we're not finished with him yet. Part 2 of our conversation will be published on November 8th. That episode will include Pierce sharing more stories about Bird and discussion about Tiger Woods, Tom Brady, Bill Belichick, the NBA of the 1980s, the National Sports Daily, and other tales. Hope you can join us. I'm buying. Thanks for listening to Pressbox Access. You can find us here with a new episode every other Wednesday. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe and follow us on Apple Podcasts or on your favorite podcast app. We'd love for you to review us. 5 stars would be nice. Follow us on social media. drop us an email at pressboxaccess@gmail.com. And be sure to spread the word. Everyone is welcome here. This has been a production of Evergreen Podcast. A special thank you to executive producers Michael D'Aloia and Gerardo Orlando, producer Bill Huffman, and our audio engineer Nathan Corson. I'm your host, Todd Jones. It's closing time. Rock on.
Ready to up your game and learn more about the thrilling world of sports betting? Introducing Double Down with Breslow, the ultimate podcast about the business of sports gambling. Join me, James Breslow, and a long list of expert guests as we dive into the art and science of the sports betting industry. Evolving regulations, technology enhancements, and the meteoric rise in the number of players makes this sector the fastest growing and most intriguing in the world. Unlock the business secrets from many of the industry's most recognizable C-suite executives, including famous odds makers and influencers. Every episode of Double Down with Breslow is packed with insider tips, deeply skilled analysis, and in-depth discussions. Don't miss out on the ultimate resource for mastering the business of sports betting. Listen to Double Down with Breslow on the Evergreen Podcast Network or wherever you listen to podcasts. That's Double Down with Breslow, the business of sports betting podcast.